Feifei can safely enter his den. A seemingly simple task, but Lulu has other ideas. In the wild, the higher a male leaves his mark, the stronger and more virile he's considered, and the more attractive he is to the ladies. With Lulu safely indoors, it's time to introduce Feifei. At first sight, it seems that Lulu, like Wu Gong, isn't at all interested in Feifei. But the keeper's experience tells a different story.
他有些时候你是幻觉，有时候起得早，有时候他还不一定，有时候他就反复的很毛，有时候看的时候有点进来，我现在有半天没得反应的，有时候呢，等他再稳一下也比较好。他只要能确定起来再进来的比较稳。
慢慢等嘛，还早。
It may be early for the adults, but for the products of last year's mating, it's well past their bedtime. Not that many of the cubs make a distinction between sleep and activity. As evening draws on, Feifei's hormone level peaks, and as it begins to fall, the pressure is on for one of the male pandas to perform. Despite his earlier lack of interest, the keepers decide to give Wu Gong another go. At first, things seem to be going well. But then Wu Gong seems to lose all sense of direction. Feifei, in turn, loses patience with him and vents her frustration. Disappointed keepers take an even more disappointed Feifei back to her own pen. It's time to bring Lulu in again. To everyone's relief, not least Feifei's, tonight's mating is a success. Copulation lasts a highly satisfactory 6 minutes and 29 seconds. Having been up most of the night, Lulu is in need of a little rest and recuperation. Wu Gung, however, still has a healthy appetite. But his lackluster performance the previous day has serious implications. Half of the centre's female pandas' estrogen levels are now peaking. They need to be mated soon, or there won't be enough pandas next year. They cannot rely solely on Lulu, despite his successful track record, because they must introduce more males to the breeding group and widen the gene pool.
我们要考虑遗传多样性，尽量让它不让一个熊猫表达的太多，它有一个替代作用，就是逐步的淘汰的。从理论上讲是很少的，所以我们要尽量考虑这个遗传多样性，但是乳鹿也不能繁殖太多。
Ling Ling, the third male on the team, is introduced to Cao Cao. But things don't quite work out. He appears no more adept at mating than Wu Gung. Reinforcements are required. They come in the shape of Chung Chung, whose name means strong. He's actually a 21-year-old male panda in the process of losing his teeth and hair. Chung Chung might not seem an ideal solution to the problem, but he's not expected to perform in the same way as the other males. With the female panda's biological clocks ticking away, Chung Chung has a more indirect but vital role to play. His semen has just been collected in the hospital, and while he recovers from the anaesthetic, his contribution to the breeding programme will be put to good use. As has happened many times before. Chung Chung has been a vital, if unwitting, participant in the plan to save the planet's precious pandas. Fei Fei, having been successfully mated with Lulu, will now undergo artificial insemination. Many of the breeding females at Wulong are artificially inseminated as well as being mated naturally.
自然交配以后，我们再让它做人工受精，这个双胞胎率要增加30%左右。
Twins have played a crucial part in reaching Wulong's breeding target and making it a success story. Before Fei Fei can undergo artificial insemination, she needs to be anaesthetised. She must be thoroughly checked over and, most importantly, weighed to ensure that the right amount of anaesthetic is administered. Once sedated, she's raced to the hospital so that the artificial insemination can be completed before she wakes up. The calculations were apparently wrong. But for safety, they erred on the side of caution. Too little is better than too much. The artificial insemination is completed and Feifei is put in a quiet enclosure away from the breeding pens. They won't know for sure if it was successful until late summer, when the birthing season begins. Many of the other females in the block are also stimulated by the comings and goings in the other pens. Shishi starts chirping and moaning very loudly, and it's decided to try Wu Gong to see if she is more his type than Feifei. Shishi is visibly irritated by Wu Gong's apparent incompetence. She turns on him. Then Wu Gong suddenly reveals another side to his character. Perhaps he's not the apathetic, passive panda he appears to be. Despite his outburst, the keepers know Wu Gong's true character and easily tempt him away from Shishi with his real interest in life. Lulu, meanwhile, is being reacquainted with his very first love, Ying Ying. Like Lulu, she was a wild caught panda, but at 8 years older, more mature and experienced. But Lulu's lost that loving feeling and shows absolutely no interest. Disappointed, they move her through to Wu Gong. But no joy. Aware that Ying Ying's hormone level has peaked and is dropping, there's a sense of urgency. But persisting with Lulu backfires horribly. It may look frightening, but the keepers aren't worried. The centre's director is also unperturbed by the violence and points to an even more logical explanation for the aggression.
因为在野外，你知道它是要靠打，它打了以后很辛苦，就是它消耗了很多的能量，然后它进行交配，交配以后它再没有这个能力来打这个雌性熊猫了。那这样的情况它不一样，因为它没有打斗，是我们人为的安排，所以它能量很充足。它这个交配以后呢，它还有这个能量要想征服这个雌性熊猫，还想打这个。
As is painfully evident when Lulu is introduced to Long Shin.
这种情况当然是有一定危险性的，没有生命的危险，就是说熊猫，当然就我刚才说到，耳朵掉了，嘴给拉裂了，眼睛给打瞎的，这都有，但是还有手掌给撕开了，这些都有，但是没有死亡的可能性。
Perhaps best illustrated when Ling Ling is introduced to Mei Cheng, and the situation becomes even more violent. She races next door to try to get away from him. Once safely indoors, Mei Cheng is clearly terrified, but only suffers minor cuts and scratches. Nothing serious.
我们在野外这么多年没有发现有交配把熊猫给打到死亡的是没有的。
Comparing the behaviour of captive pandas and their wild relatives is an important part of Wulong's work. The long-term plan is to release some of Wulong's pandas into the wild. One of the reasons there are only 8 breeding pens available out of a possible 10 is because 2 of the pens are currently being used by the release team. As more and more females start to come into estrus, the breeding team thinks they should have priority over the pens.
要他那个我们这个靠是皮可以
这个他说他不是害人，
给防止那个口气强一点。这些人啊，到时候那个完成不了任务找哪个麻烦？还不是找我们底下实验嘛？是人没法请，我们这边是主要的，他那边犯规那边也算是主要，但是我们肯定要考虑我们这边。
你做实验你可以推出，只是手机。
他不是现在就要
我清楚这个问题。
Once they've successfully reached the target of 300 pandas for a sustainable captive population, the hope is to use those pandas to help reach a sustainable wild population of 3,000. But the centre's director is sceptical.
我认为大熊猫这个野生大熊猫要摆脱濒危，并不是说我们野生大熊猫我们圈养大熊猫要繁殖多少，野生大熊猫才摆脱濒危。它不可能说无限制的增加，因为每个大熊猫它活动的范围从3平方公里到15平方公里，它有一个活动范围的。在这么个大范围内，不可能说你从一只熊猫跟它增加到很大，所以在野生大熊猫这个种群数量方面，你要快速的增加是不可能的。所以说，我只能说我们人工繁殖的情况下，尽最大努力来满足这个圈养大熊猫一个可持续发展。所以说，你种群数量全国的那个野生大熊猫种群数量要达到3000只，这只是我们希望它达到。
The real problem for wild pandas remains the lack of protected habitat. This is part of that precious protected habitat. 850 kilometres northeast of Wulong, 6,000 feet up in the Chinling Mountains. On the site of an ancient Buddhist temple, a team of scientists at the Qingling Giant Panda Research Base have been studying the behaviour of wild pandas for more than a decade. The damp climate may be good for bamboo and pandas, but it's not so good for humans trying to study them. When there is a break in the clouds, observing the behaviour of wild pandas is considered easier here than in Sichuan.
"到这边来了，看见大熊猫的频率呢，那个频率还是比较高的，相对于四川那边来说，四川在野外要看见一只大熊猫非常困难。在这里啊，它那个一个是地形非常平坦，另外一个熊猫种群密度非常高。
The density may be higher than in Sichuan, but there are still only around 60 to 100 pandas living in an area of around 300 square kilometres. And searching for these elusive wild pandas to study requires long treks, sometimes for several days, and climbing thousands of feet. As at Wulong, it's the spring mating season, and the chances of seeing pandas in the wild are increased because the pandas come down to the lower slopes to mate. Until a female is successfully mated, a number of males will congregate wherever she leaves her scent marks. The task of finding and filming giant pandas is still far from simple. But after a long and exhausting climb, the sound of loud bleating and chirping raises hopes of a chance to get close enough to study them. Not too close. Like any wild bear, they're very dangerous, especially at a time like this.
但是发现树上有只熊猫，那树下有只熊猫，但树上那只熊猫是母熊猫，树下那只熊猫是公熊猫。然后是在离这只公熊猫那个不远的地方还有2只公熊猫。
This is a very rare sighting of one of Feifei's distant wild cousins. From the growls, it's obvious the males will have no energy left for fighting, as Lulu does with the females in Wulong. Since the last national survey of panda numbers in 2001, which calculated that there were around 1,600 wild pandas, scientists here have completed another survey of a number of reserves and subsequently come up with a very surprising result.
所以我们估计啊，可能目前全国野生大熊猫总数量呢，可能有2000到3000只。
The wild panda population might have already reached the magical figure of 3,000. But Dr. Zhang Zejun still doesn't consider this to be a sustainable population and believes that the giant panda remains an endangered species. And even if the future looks a little brighter for pandas, another ominous threat to the survival of the species is emerging. High in the Qinling Mountains, research scientist He Jiangbo has been observing the pandas' food as closely as the pandas themselves. Here, they eat around 20 kilos of bamboo every day, mainly Bashana bamboo. And he's discovered something very worrying.
这就是巴山墨竹所开的花。巴山墨竹开花以后，它会死亡，死亡以后这熊猫就会因为食物胆怯而死亡。在上世纪80年代，四川呢就发生了大面积的竹林开花。在秦岭，现在在秦岭地区也曾面临着这个问题。
Ancient folklore says that when bamboo flowers, death and destruction follow, and modern science agrees. The bamboo will die within 3 to 5 years after flowering. Then the seeds will drop into the soil, but will take another 7 to 10 years to germinate and become edible once more. If panda numbers really have risen to 3,000, they're now at risk of plummeting again.
目前呢，就是我们的研究小组啊，就说是我们想通过就是改变这个竹林的结构，是否能达到它延缓竹子的开花的这样的一个结果。大家知道，竹子开花是一个不可避免的过程，一般就说是它是60到100年，它是一个周期，一个生命周期。这个时间啊，现在没有一个统一的定论。
While they struggle to avoid the same fate that befell the pandas in Wulong, ultimately, scientists here are absolutely clear about what needs to be done to protect giant pandas, whether there are 1,600 or as many as 3,000.
我认为应该是2个方面，一个方面呢是保护好现有的野生大熊猫的种群，包括保护好它的栖息地，尽量减少对它栖息地里边各种外的因素的干扰。另外一个方面呢，那就是必须加快圈养大熊猫的饲养繁殖，加强有关野生大熊猫放归方面的科学研究以及其他方面的准备工作，争取在最短的时间内尽快将圈养大熊猫成功的放归到野外去。
Back at Wulong, they're getting on with the first part of that task, making more pandas. It's now April, the peak of the breeding season, and as more and more females come into estrus, the keepers are under increasing pressure. Whether they'll reach this year's target depends a great deal on Wu Gung, who seems to have no sense of urgency. Despite his hopeless history, the keepers are encouraged by Wu Gung's burst of energy during his earlier encounter with Shishi. They've decided to reintroduce him to Ying Ying. Wu Gung, however, seems to have reverted to his old ways, suffering from an apparent lack of coordination. Things seem to be going in ever-decreasing circles. As Wu Gung looks around as if he's desperate for encouragement or support, disappointed keepers decide to cut the meeting short and tempt him away. Wu Gung obviously interprets the apple as sustenance and hangs on, while Ying Ying is clearly unimpressed with the entire performance. After yet another disappointment, the last chance is the other male in the group, Ling Ling. But Ling Ling isn't being very cooperative. The reason for Ling Ling's obstinate behaviour is in the voluptuous shape of a new female in the pens, Shi Mei, which means happy and lucky girl. Shi Mei's scent drives Ling Ling crazy, and her appeal isn't limited to him. Shimei appears to be a source of passion and delight to all the boy bears, most of all Lulu. She successfully mated with both Ling Ling and Lulu in 2006 and subsequently gave birth to twins. But last year, Shimei mysteriously came into estrus 6 months late, which was a source of concern for the keepers and Lulu alike, and resulted in the latter banging against the side of his pen for weeks on end. Shimei has now returned to a normal cycle, and it's having a big impact on all her neighbours. There's something about this panda that drives wild pandas even wilder. Surely even Wu Gong will find her charms impossible to ignore. Alas, not. With Lulu gazing longingly at the love of his life, things between Shimei and Wu Gong follow a familiar path. At one point, the roles are even reversed. Finally, the moment arrives for lovesick Lulu to show Wu Gong how it's done. But instead of leaping on Shimei in his usual domineering way, Lulu romps about with her, and they play like small cubs. Both behave like mating is just a big game. It's hard to believe that Lulu is the same panda that was so aggressive with the other females. She may, or may not, be the love of his life. Their coupling looks likely to succeed without any of the drama and violence that marred other matings. But whether their relationship will result in cubs capable of being released into the wild, it's impossible to know. Wulong will probably reach the target of 15 pandas this year, in spite of Ling Ling and Wu Gong's slow start. These are some of their offspring from last year. The cubs' early ancestors lived around 2 million years ago. Their decline is due to us. Whether these pandas will become part of a sustainable population and survive for even a fraction of that time isn't the responsibility of Lulu, Ling Ling, or even Wu Gong. It's also down to us.
Get you. You probably will.
Oh, the other two, they just switch spoon positions, that's all.
Oh, give up.
Yay!
He's just rolling all over the place.
That one's probably really young.
He's like, you hurt me. I give up.
Definitely gonna be allowed in the zoo ever again. Yeah, so was the other one. She was climbing trees and doing somersaults. I didn't like this. I didn't like this. This one's the age of 6. She's only let out. She was only let out into this main. Well, yesterday she did. And then it was let out a day or two.
It has webbed feet like a frog, a bill like a duck, and venom like a snake. And oddest of all, it lays eggs like a bird. So much of its life is spent underwater or underground that the life of the platypus is still largely unknown. An irresistible challenge to filmmaker David Pera.
I've always been fascinated by the mysteries of how platypus have their young. And over the next 3 years, we're going to take you on a journey to discover what happens deep inside their nesting burrows. It's a truly amazing story.
Maybe she's active.
By tracking its daily life, researchers will help Pera reveal the most intimate moments in the life of what is surely the strangest animal on Earth. The high plateau of Tasmania, the southernmost link in a mountain chain that stretches the whole length of Australia's eastern coast. When the winter blizzards blow in from the Southern Ocean, life here gets tough. Yet, even here, the platypus thrives. Its thick fur provides near-perfect insulation as it forages for a sparse living in the frozen tarns. The spring thaw turns mountain streams into torrents. Humans are rare in the remote Tasmanian wilderness, but platypuses are plentiful. There's prey to catch with their probing bills under every rock. Shrimps and worms, and the larvae of aquatic insects.
I've looked for platypus up and down the east coast of Australia, but the wild rivers of Tasmania are the greatest place to find them. But even here, they're difficult to see. They seem to meld into the water and rocks, and then suddenly disappear.
When Europeans first encountered it, the platypus seemed almost too weird to be real. The name comes from the Greek for flat-footed, yet it was the creature's duck bill that most fascinated 19th century zoologists. "200 years on, we're just beginning to understand what a remarkable instrument it is. In fact, there's a lot about this secretive animal that we're only finding out now. As the early naturalists discovered, the platypus is not an easy animal to study. Its burrows may run back into the banks for 30 metres. And they soon learned to be cautious. They found that the venomous spur of an angry male caused pain and swelling that lasted for weeks. So it wasn't till the 1880s that scientists confirmed that the platypus really did lay eggs. By the early 1900s, they were learning how to keep platypuses alive in captivity. In 1944, naturalist David Flay successfully bred from a captive pair called Jack and Jill.
Months ago, David Flay noticed Jill was building a nest. He knew she was building up her milk supply. He then dug down and uncovered the burrow. To his delight, he found a youngster, already well grown.
But this would be the only platypus born in captivity for 50 years. And even today, little is known about how they breed in the wild. A quiet valley in northern Tasmania, in the headwaters of the South Esk River. An unassuming farm dam proves an ideal site for biologist Nina Kosh. She needs to trap a female platypus, the first step in an ambitious project.
It's really unbelievable that these farm dams can be such a good place for platypus to live in. They seem to be enormously productive, ideal habitat for females to breed in.
I heard about Nina's work in Tasmania and came over to join her. Perhaps she may be able to help us in our quest to find breeding platypus.
Nina has been fascinated by the platypus ever since she saw one on TV as a child. Now she's come all the way from Germany to take part in a 2-year study. The aim? To find out more about how female platypuses raise their young. First, Nina measures the platypus's exact dimensions. The tiny craters in her leathery bill are receptors. Some are sensitive to touch, others to the minute electrical impulses emitted by her prey.
Just keep on. Yeah, that will do. Be probably old enough. Not healthy enough.
Next, Nina attaches a tiny radio transmitter to the platypus's fur. It needs to be tested thoroughly before next year's full-scale breeding study. Nina decides to call the female Shy, after a platypus character in a children's book. Within days, Nina has identified the precise location of one of Shy's sleeping burrows on an island in the dam.
We've tracked Shy for a couple of days now, and we could follow her to this island. And she's sleeping right here in her burrow, and we are going to put an infrared video camera in so we can see what she's doing in her burrow.
Just before dawn, Shy returns to sleep. For Nina and her partner Marcus Utesh, this is the first view of a platypus underground.
There she is. She's coming in.
Next year, they'll try to get a camera inside the burrow of a breeding platypus.
That is absolutely great. Wow.
A few weeks later, Nina and Marcus find a baby platypus near the dam. It's only just emerged from the nest. Soon after, they find another, bigger youngster.
This baby looked much more like an adult. It weighed 610 grams, so double the size of the one that we caught before. We released this baby in one of the farm dams, and then it started immediately to feed along the border of the lake. We tried the next day to see it again. I sat on the pontoon and paddled towards the little platypus. He just stopped feeding and suddenly even came closer to me. He was by far more curious than afraid.
Nina is hooked. This will be an ideal location for next year's study. The The only other animals on Earth that are even distantly related to the platypus are the echidnas. Like the platypus, the short-beaked echidna has looked much the same since the age of the dinosaurs. It too has evolved a highly specialised mouth, not a bill, but a beak, which can be used as a crowbar if need be, and a long sticky tongue to pull ants and termites from deep within their nests. Despite their different lifestyles, the echidna and the platypus share one crucial characteristic. They're the only surviving members of an ancient group of egg-laying mammals, the monotremes.
That's faster.
Peggy Rismiller and Mike McKelvey have been tracking and studying echidnas for 15 years. What they've discovered about the echidna's breeding cycle may help David Pereira in his pursuit of the platypus.
Let's whisper.
Up to a dozen echidnas at a time may be carrying transmitters.
Okay. It's always worth seeing what Harry's doing.
What Harry's doing is looking for a mate. Mostly, echidnas lead solitary lives, but when a female comes on heat, males will gather from far and wide.
But the females emit a scent, and the scent is called a pheromone, and it's something that humans often can't smell, but obviously the males can smell it. The pheromone, of course, would be able to go cross-country on wind and attract the males. And we've seen males cross this peninsula several times and then eventually end up with a female.
Hari and several other males are already here. And Whisper is on his way.
Yep, he's there.
Whisper joins what's called an echidna train, a group of males all paying court to a single female.
Okay. She had no burrow over here?
A train can stay in place for up to a week, with the males constantly jockeying for position. They must be patient, but ready for instant action. Mating will take place just once, when the female decides that the time and the partner are right. To try to capture the elusive courtship ritual of the platypus, David travels to the far north of Queensland. Here, in the tropical rainforest, the mating season has already begun. This female is feeding hard to ready herself for the rigours of motherhood. Every 40 seconds or so, she must surface to breathe. This is when she's most vulnerable. Eyes and ears are open wide, alert for danger. But as soon as she dives, she shuts them tight. Using only the sensors in her bill, she's built up a detailed mental map of her feeding ground. And she knows its inhabitants too, especially the resident cormorant. The white-faced heron minds its own business. The cormorant minds the platypuses. Each time the platypus dives, the cormorant follows, snapping up shrimp and small fish flushed out by the foraging platypus. And if the platypus rests too long between dives, the cormorant lets her know it. In this particular river system, almost every pool has several resident platypuses and a single cormorant ready to exploit them. The other inhabitants of the pool give the platypus no trouble at all. The azure kingfishers are peaceable neighbours too. They may occasionally snap up fish and shrimp she drives to the surface, but at least they don't harass her to dive for them. Most platypuses have a broader home range than a single pool. This muddy tributary to the main stream is a favourite feeding ground. Platypuses make their way up the creek at all hours of the day and night to feed. They can sense the vibrations of their prey through the receptors in their bills.
I've been here for about 3 months now and been desperately trying to find a place where the platypus are courting. I think we might be onto something here. This is firm flat. It appears to be dominated by a male, and he does his patrolling, and again it appears that there's a female who I think is just coming up to her burrow or area that she spends a lot of time at now.
As the light begins to fade, the platypuses start to make their way further up the narrow creek. There's even better feeding where it runs through cleared farmland, but the platypuses will only venture there at night.
This is an ideal creek to film platypus with an infrared camera. I really like using infrared cameras because you can capture behaviours at night that no one's ever seen before. We put up a red light. The platypus can see the red light, but they don't seem to be disturbed by it. Sitting there beside the bank of the river with the water running through my boots and the legs of the tripod in the water, as the animals slowly worked their way up towards me, they would stop and glance up and then keep on coming. They were totally unafraid. In the first hour after dark, 6 platypus passed me. And then a water rat appeared. Water rats are about the same size as a platypus, but much fiercer.
A few nights later, David Perra sets up his infrared equipment on a bridge overlooking the main river. Just below the bridge, a big male platypus has established his home range. But tonight, he has a challenger from further up the river. The resident male is grooming himself on a log, apparently unaware of the intruder. Despite being caught by surprise, the resident male has won the encounter easily. He hasn't had to use his most damaging weapon. The poisonous spur on his hind leg is fed by a venom gland that in the breeding season reaches its maximum size. Day and night now, the big male patrols his home range. He spotted another male lurking behind a stump. Without hesitation, he steams into battle. Whether platypuses regularly use their spurs in these encounters, or whether they're weapons of last resort, we don't know. In this case, the resident male is triumphant, and a female is ready to be courted. The male grasps the female's tail, and the courtship dance begins. The dance can continue for 20 minutes or more. Whether the female is courted and mated by many males or just one is something else we don't know for sure. Finally, it looks as though the male mounts the female and mating takes place. The bare patch on her tail may be a sign that she's been courted often in recent days. Now she's returning to her nesting burrow. 1 or 2 eggs, perhaps even 3, are on the way. Healesville Sanctuary in southern Australia. Much of what we know about platypus mating and breeding has been learned by Les Fisk and his colleagues from the captive animals at Healesville Sanctuary. For 10 years, a male and female platypus have lived in this elaborate artificial world. Through a maze of tunnels, pipes and tanks, video cameras record their every move. Two years ago, for the first time since David Flay's success in the 1940s, Fisk managed to breed platypuses in captivity. For most of the year, Karina, the female, will have nothing to do with N, the male. But spring is in the air at Healesville Sanctuary. David Perra has already been manning his remote cameras for 2 weeks. Today, finally, the preliminaries are over and the serious courtship has begun. the moment that she's ready to mate can be fleeting. N is determined that he's the one who'll be around when that moment comes. But her attempted escape was all part of the ritual. Karina soon returns to the dance. Two years ago, this couple successfully produced twins. Judging by the way the courtship is consummated, the signs are good for this season too. Summer has come again to Tasmania, and its wild rivers are swollen with melting snow. In a quiet backwater, as temperatures rise and the days lengthen, a female platypus is collecting material for her nest. She takes leaves one by one in her bill and jams them under her tail. To safeguard it from flooding, she's dug the entrance to her burrow several metres up the steep bank. Over the next few days, she'll make dozens of trips like this, until the nesting chamber at the end of her long burrow is lined with sticks and leaves. Back on the South Esk River, Nina Koch and Marcus Utesh are joined once again by David Pera for the start of a new season's work.
In the early afternoon, we go down to the South Esk River and set up a series of nets. These nets were originally designed to catch eels, but they're also really good and safe for catching platypus as well.
Ja, genau.
They position the nets across the water flow to trap the nightly traffic of platypuses as they feed up and down the river.
In the late afternoon, the platypus come out of their burrows and start feeding. They're very good at avoiding nets because their sensitive bill can pick up the water flowing through the mesh. Many evade the nets, but eventually we catch one.
Judging by the dates that last year's youngsters emerged from their nesting burrow, Nina and Marcus have worked out that the females will be laying their eggs very soon. Now is the time to fix radio transmitters to them. This one has a large bare patch on her tail, a sign that she's probably been courted intensively.
The tail. Yeah, but on all the animal. This might be a mating mark. All the fur is away from the tail, surface.
They discovered that she's one of the females they trapped and tagged last year. In fact, it's their old friend, Shy.
80-17, that's Shy.
Wow. We got Shy back. Welcome back.
Great.
After several weeks' exhausting work setting nets up and down the river, Nina and Marcus managed to catch 7 females. Each one is fitted with a new transmitter and released back into the river exactly where she was caught. For Nina and Marcus, it's the start of another period of intense work, tracking all 7 females for hours at a time. They find there's a wide variation in the platypus's behaviour. Some feed mostly in daylight. Others sleep during the day and feed all night. Some travel a kilometre or more up and down the river each feeding session. Others, including Shy, feed in one pool most of the time.
Where's the strongest signal coming from? Downstream or?
No. She must be sitting in there.
Wow.
Shy sleeps in the same burrow each day. Nina and Marcus want to pinpoint its exact location because there's a good chance it's where she's built a nest and is nursing her young.
Get reception here. And it's getting weaker.
Which gain do you have?
10.
Gain 10, maximum gain.
Gain 10 and only have like 1. I would say it's about here. It must be around here. Not this point here. It gets weaker here.
Yep. But it's exciting. Get another burrow.
Yep.
And we should
And
mark
this one
the
looks a bit.
entrance.
This one looks a bit different than the others. Yeah.
We should mark the entrance.
Meanwhile, Peggy Rismiller and Mike McKelvey are still keeping track of their echidnas.
You think try again from here? Oh yeah, right towards that cypress.
3 weeks ago, this female was at the head of a mating train. She should by now have laid an egg.
Okay, I'm just going to feel first. Very tight little pouch.
Up quite a bit there, 'cause my fingers.
Jula, just be very careful because there is an egg. Oh my Jesus.
See if you can get it closer down your way.
I'm going to pull the pouch open.
There's
There
the
it
egg.
is. There's the egg.
It's an egg
And
there.
there's a girl.
10 days after the egg is laid, a puggle will hatch.
In the egg, the echidna develops an enamel-covered egg tooth. It needs this egg tooth to actually rip open this leathery shell and then pull itself out onto the mother's belly. Look, there's the back of it. Inside the pouch, it's really moist and humid because that's what the puggle needs right now. As far as we know, at 2 grams, it has to breathe through its skin.
Tiny though it is, the puggle can safely be removed from its mother's pouch for a minute or so. At 2 days old, there's almost no difference between a baby echidna and a baby platypus. Less than 2 weeks later, it's already 100 times heavier than when it was hatched.
It's a girl.
The baby echidna by now has a discernible beak, just as a baby platypus would have a recognisable bill. After 7 weeks in the pouch, the mother leaves her young one in a burrow, returning every 5 days or so to let it suckle. Instead of nipples, the mother has specially adapted paws clustered in patches on her tummy. As the baby suckles, the mother expresses the milk through her skin.
It doesn't need its eyes. I think it's like all very small animals. They go on scent. And so the young is scenting where the milk patch is.
At 6 months, the young one is almost ready for independence. Back at the South Esk River, Marcus and Nina have decided that the time has come to try to take a look inside Shy's nesting burrow.
Kann das noch ein Vader sein von dir?
Shy has been feeding regularly for 16 hours in every 24, returning to the same burrow each day to sleep. They're sure she's nursing young. It's late evening. Shy's already left the burrow to feed. Nina, Marcus and David have at least 8 hours to try to get a glimpse inside the nesting chamber. First, Marcus drills a hole carefully into the burrow roof. Frequent measurements over the past 2 weeks have told him exactly where and how deep to drill. Meanwhile, David sets up and tests an endoscope with a tiny video camera mounted on its end.
So down is like that.
Yep.
So straighten it up.
It was really exciting going down into the nest chamber for the first time. Those are roots coming down into the top. And then we saw the entrance to the chamber itself. And the nest was a really complex structure. It was tightly woven leaves wrapped around with sticks and roots. And there was even some green plastic in amongst the leaves.
Yeah, that's the roof there, I think.
But that's when our frustrations really began. Over a period of 17 days, we went in 6 times into the burrow, but we just couldn't penetrate the nest. And then at last, we got the endoscope through the nest wall. We first glimpsed a tiny bit of flesh through the leaves. And then another period of frustration, half an hour trying to get a glimpse of the bill.
Oh, it's a platypus. Yes.
The bill looked huge through the endoscope, but it was really only a centimetre long. The front feet already had claws. And then, to our amazement, we saw there were 2 babies, not one, crammed into the tiny nest.
Thank you.
3 weeks later, we went into the burrow again, and we found them immediately. It's incredible. They'd grown enormously. Now they were covered in a thin layer of fur. There were even visitors inside the burrow.
What is it? It's a tick. I think it was a tick.
The ticks are only found on platypus, and already they're feeding on the blood of the young ones. Their bills are now large and very dark. We think the young are now about 6 or 7 weeks old. We're eager to see how the various parts of their body have developed. Their front feet have webbing between the toes, and on their back foot is the beginnings of a spur. The smaller one is female. The larger one has a much bigger spur, It's obviously a male. We called him Bigfoot. The nostrils are huge. We think they're probably used to find the milk patches of the mother. And here, the smaller one is rubbing the tummy of the larger one, as if it's trying to suckle. It was a revealing 3 hours in the burrow.
Nina is spending hours each day by the riverbank recording Shy's feeding patterns. It's late summer on the South Esk, and vast numbers of insects are hatching from the river. It's an ideal time for Shy to be feeding her young.
She's just feeding enormously. She spends 16 hours out in the river, and she just goes along the river, and wherever she is, just feeds. Unbelievable hungry little female.
A nursing platypus will consume up to half her body weight in food every 24 hours. Most of it consists of tiny morsels, which she must somehow find and separate from the leaves, mud or gravel on the riverbed. When she gets to the surface, she chews with a sideways motion of her grinding pads, separating out and swallowing the food. In a single feeding session, she may dive up to 1,000 times. Tonight, the team plan to go into Shy's burrow once again. So, while Nina tracks Shy to make sure she's out feeding, the team drills a new hole into her nesting chamber. This time, they're installing a tiny remote-controlled camera that will be able to film Shy feeding her young without disturbing her. Illumination comes from miniature infrared lights, which she can't see. And as well as the camera, there's a microphone to pick up sound inside the burrow.
That's the big one.
There, oh.
The babies are now about 13 weeks old. Their eyes are open, their bills are fully formed, and their coats have grown thick. While Bigfoot plays with tree roots in the roof of the chamber, the smaller one is perhaps getting ready to take on solid food. Nina warns that Shy is on her way back to the burrow. As she approaches the nesting chamber, she unblocks the earthen plugs which she set there to protect her young. Then she's through into the chamber.
Here we go.
Within minutes, the eager young are greedily suckling from their mother's milk patches. But the team is about to see behaviour that no one has ever seen before.
That is amazing. The young stopped suckling and then began to rub their mother's bill. Are they taking food from her? Perhaps getting a taste of those little animals that they themselves will be eating in the next few weeks? Or are they drinking her saliva? Maybe getting some of the bacteria that will strengthen their immune system. We don't really know what we're seeing in these extraordinary pictures.
Soon, Shire's had enough. She busily rebuilds the nest around her young. And then she's gone, leaving a tangle of tails and bills behind her. Ten days later, on watch as usual beside Shire's pool, Marcus and Nina spot one of the young platypuses in the water. Bigfoot, the male, has emerged from the nest. The team watches, enthralled, as the last chapter in the drama they've been following for months unfolds. Bigfoot needs no tuition from his mother. Minutes after his emergence, he's swimming and foraging expertly along the bank. He asserts his independence swiftly. Within a few weeks, he's travelling well upstream from his mother's pool. Soon, he'll have to leave this rich feeding ground. He's trespassing on the home range of older, larger males.